Y'all ready for this? Yeah. Somebody's excited. Who was that? You ready? Thank you. All right, let me see how much rope I have on this. Not very much. Is there any way to get more rope out of this? Or is that it? Let's see if I can get just a little more, maybe not. Okay, well, I can't move around very much, but that's okay. I don't really need to. All right, so I'm Dr. DeMott, and my co-worker on this was Rafal, and you guys probably see me around at different conferences, so I won't spend a long time on the who are we, but nice guys, do a lot of training and speaking, various places. My peer Rafal has broken everything from CPUs to BIOS, hypervisors, kernels, you name it, brilliant guy. I'm lucky to work with some of the people I work with, and I think a couple others are here maybe. Is Vadim in here? Where is he? He's not gonna raise his hand. I got a couple other coworkers here as well. Maybe Robert. Yes, you're in here, aren't you? There you are. I don't know, is Nick here? Where's he? Oh, okay. Anyway, we've got some smart folks that we work with. But what I want to make clear to you is that this is not in any way affiliated with my company. This is independent research, not representing the opinions of anyone but myself. So let me get that disclaimer right out there ahead of time. And so the motivation for this is, there's been this ongoing cat and mouse in security, right? All the way back, 15 years more than that really, but it didn't heat up until about 15 years ago. Stack overflows got big, people were doing them forever, and then along came stack canaries and ASLR and DEP and all this other stuff. If you followed my research at all, you may have seen other stuff like Emmet or isolated heap or deferred free, or basically all the time there's new barriers being put up to slow down attackers, okay? New walls, new hurdles that make exploitation of memory corruption bugs really difficult, getting harder all the time. And so, what I want to make clear also, right up front, is that Microsoft is leading the charge on this. They're brilliant company. I have a great relationship personally with some of the security people at Microsoft, and my company that I work for also has a great relationship with Microsoft. But again, this talk is not in any way affiliated with any particular company. So, because Microsoft is the one I'm always looking at their stuff, right? Looking at I just looked at Emmet and then isolated heap and deferred free and now control flow guard. Their latest, they're the ones out there leading this, these new protections. It's not Adobe, it's not Oracle, it's not some of these other companies. So my hat's off to what Microsoft's doing. So in no way is this talk intended to bash them. It's more to just point out a weakness. However, having said all that, I was politely asked just yesterday, despite 2 months' notice ahead of time, asked to ensure that people understand the limitations to the bypass. Hi, Dave. One of which is if you're running 64-bit code on Windows 10, which apparently Edge is now actually 64-bit on a 64-bit system when you start it. All the other versions of IE, even on a 64-bit system, when you start IE, they start as 32-bit. So then this technique wouldn't work as well on fully pure 64-bit everything. So I want to make sure that I point that out right up front and be very clear on that. We'll get back to that a little bit later on why I was asked to say that. So I don't really need to do a summary. I won't do much of this. I'll kind of blow through this pretty quick. But, ROP's been around a while, and it's kind of, it was after the stack buffer overflow, and then ROP is meant to take a RW page into a RWX page, right, to defeat DEP. And to do that, you need some sort of memory disclosure, right? You got to have an ASLR leak, right? And there's been a variety of these throughout the years, whether it's just originally it was third-party DLLs were slow to adopt because it was opt-in, and then that kind of got taken care of. And then there have been other bugs just in ASLR in general, or more specific use after freeze that allowed for a memory leak. So there's all kinds of reasons why, memory corruption bugs could still be working. So then, of course, things like Emmet came along, and then I gave a talk a couple years ago about how to bypass stuff like Emmet. And it wasn't picking on any particular thing. I'm not picking on Emmet. Emmet's a great tool. Okay, everything that's coming out of the research that they're doing is great stuff. It's just pointing out that's our job as a researcher, right? Okay, think about that for a second. Imagine if the Volkswagen guys had come to the researchers who found the thing about the emissions and said, hey, we really don't want you to talk about the emissions problem. We think that'd be bad for our business. And the researcher goes, yeah, it probably would be, but, that's our job. We're researchers. We talk about stuff, so, it is what it is. So that's just what I'm doing. I'm not, poking at anything. I'm just doing what I do as a researcher, okay? And so, ROP lives on. And there's ways to bypass various protections, whether it's, DEP or emit or isolated heap or whatever it is, because of powerful bugs like use after freeze. And I won't go really into what they are because I've talked about it in prior talks. You can watch some of my previous material. If you're not familiar with any of the terms I've used, just follow some of the research I've done and you can find that pretty easily. So one of the other slides I've thrown up in the past, and I'll just speak to it real quick briefly here, is the fact that you can stop attacks at different points. And kind of the worst point to stop an attack is when code is already running on the endpoint, right? Like at the AV level. That's kind of the worst place to try to stop an attack because it's already running. Maybe they can just disable your product or whatever, right? So, and then you move down the stack. You keep going down, right? So emit's not the greatest place because basically you're saying a ROP chain's already in the progress of running and it'll try to detect that running by hooking certain APIs and noticing that it's running. That's not the best place really to stop. But it's good. It's good to try at every one of these levers. I'm not saying that these are all bad things. I'm just saying, you should try at every place you can afford to try it, but it's harder at some places than others. ASLR and DEP's a little better because it's pretty low level. Hopefully the attack doesn't even get started. Or you could fix all the bugs in code and then there wouldn't be any problem to begin with. That's a bit hard though, right? And then of course maybe there's some other architecture or chipset we could design that wouldn't even have memory corruption bugs. So there's different places in the architecture that you could deal with these issues, and we try to do it all. And so that's the summary or sort of the introduction in the sense that, hey, all that stuff's great. It's been working great, but it doesn't stop everything. You can still bypass things. And so there's a need for something more. And Microsoft Research and many other groups academically and whatever have been thinking about this for a long time. There's this idea of CFI, control flow integrity. And what that is kind of in simple layman terms, if you don't know what CFI is, basically when you think about a program, it's got if this, else this, if this, else. There's all this program logic, right? And there's no point in the execution of the program where we should just start executing off on the stack or the heap or whatever, right? Like that's not, the programmer didn't write that. So why would you do that? And so the idea behind control flow integrity is why don't we guard every pointer, every function call and every function pointer and every return address such that it should only go to where it's programmed to go and nowhere else. And if that could be fully implemented, okay, and some of the guys I know actually at IAD, which is a division of NSA, they actually released a paper on this just recently. You can go on their GitHub and read about this. If someone could fully implement CFI properly, it has the potential to essentially stop memory corruption bugs. Whether that'll ever happen or not, we don't know. It seems unlikely based on past history, right? Nothing seems to stop everything, so probably not. But it at least has some chance. And in their paper, they call out the fact that they're against a half-baked version of this, because if you do it kind of half-heartedly, then it's going to be bypassable, which is what this talk is about. And so the question, is there a need for a relaxed version of CFI? Something that kind of goes halfway. And in one hand, there is a need for that because full CFI is expensive, right? If I go back a slide, you'll see that you'll see that, the runtime overhead, at least measured by some academics, was anywhere between 25 and 50%. That's huge, right? Like your program's half as slow. It's not acceptable performance impact. So on the one hand, there is a need for a relaxed version, okay? But is it going to have the same security benefit? No, of course not, right? Because it doesn't have all the properties. So, that's what today's stuff is about. And actually, what Microsoft created, it's called CFG, Control Flow Guard. That's their term for sort of a half-baked CFI. Basically, what they do is they protect pointers. So they're going to guard all function pointers, but only in a coarse way. So they're not protecting returns, only function pointers, and they're not saying that this function pointer can only go to the function it should go to. They're saying this function pointer should only go to the start of any valid function. Okay? So that's what's called coarse grain CFI. or Coarse Grain CFG, or whatever you want to call it, since it doesn't do returns either. And it's something a bit like, actually, what I proposed back in 2012. I proposed a ROP protection that basically did this for return addresses. It was basically a Coarse Grain, like this return should only ever go back to any other spot that a return should go to, not just anywhere. Because that's a big problem, right? That's basically how a pivot works. That's the first and most important part of your ROP chain is the pivot. And the pivot goes usually in the middle of some instruction. So you land in some goofy spot that you should never land in. Okay, it's not at the start of a function. It's not even at the end of the function. In many cases, it's like almost at the end of a function, like halfway between instructions or something. So, so there will be some definite security benefit, but it's not going to be perfect. And so, starting with Visual Studio 2015 and Windows 8.1 and higher, CFG is available. And it's a good thing. You should use it. You should upgrade to, Windows 10 or whatever you want. Like anytime you upgrade your compiler and your operating system and stuff, you get all the latest and greatest security benefits. So I'm a big fan of doing that. I think you should. You will meet some resistance though, right, from your developers. Okay, they're on Visual Studio, whatever. I don't know, 2010, whatever version they're using. It's always a couple behind. And they're not going to be real excited about moving to the bleeding edge compiler for a lot of reasons, because it's going to break everything. It's going to cost money. They're going to have to buy new licenses. There's a lot of reasons why they're not going to want to do that. But as a security person, you can lean on them and try to get them to do it anyway. And basically what it does is it adds a new section to the PE file. Okay, just like some of the other protections have done in the past, this adds a new guard section basically that has the information about which functions are the address of every valid function, basically. And they get compiled into a bitmap such that when a function is called anywhere in program space, if and only if it points to a valid function, can the function call be successful. So it's a pretty simple idea, and the impact on performance is pretty minimal, and so I think it's a good protection. It's not perfect, though. That's what I'm here to say. So, one of the ways you can go about this when you're doing this kind of research is you need some kind of sample program or whatever so that you can look at what does it look like when I corrupt a normal function pointer. And so I've just written some normal C++ program or whatever. And if you look at what a call naturally was, when you call some method in an object, you get like some call EAX or something like that. And with the protections compiled in, then you basically have this guard check before that. And it'll check to make sure it's a valid location, and if it is, then it'll do the call. Okay? So, pretty straightforward. And if you give it an invalid location, the program will crash, just like every other protection, right? If you try to, execute code on a, page that only has read-write or something, the program will crash. If Emmet detects a ROP attack on progress, the program will crash. That's the natural way of basically saying, I can't continue, I'm dead, and it just crashes. And you get an int 29 in this case, is the error you'll see for a CFG fault. So what does CFG allow? Only valid call sites in a coarse manner. And I think I said all that. There's no ROP protection. You also can call any RWX page unless it's explicitly been said no. And so then it blocks basically any other location. So, when you're doing security research and you're looking at, hey, here's this thing. Can I break it? Can I bypass it? Can I whatever? That's the next part of the project. So first, you do your homework, your history. Then you understand the need for the new thing, and then you figure out how well does the thing work. That's like how every research project should go, basically. So what's the key? The main thing is that first pivot is hard. That's the main thing that CFG brings you, because you can't change, you can't overwrite a function pointer to point to the start of your ROP chain. That when you do like an exchange EAX, ESP or something, that's going to be at some arbitrary location, and it's not going to be in the function bitmap. So you're not going to be able to do that. Also, if there's any other RWX pages in memory, you can jump to those unless they've been specifically denied with some certain API. So how do we bypass? First of all, some obvious and prior work. Obvious work would be like, since it's an opt-in protection, it has to, your code, if it's already existing, has to be recompiled with Visual Studio 2015, and you have to opt into CFG. So if you haven't done that, and you have a bug in a DLL or whatever that isn't protected, then obviously you don't need to bypass the protection. So that, I think, is fairly obvious. And it's fairly significant, though, even though it's obvious it's significant because it takes time for people, again, to adopt and to roll. And just like it did with ASLR in depth, it was quite a while before every DLL in process space was compiled with ASLR in depth. And it'll be the same with this. And the reason for that is devs need some time to check what's the performance impact of this new thing on my product. Is it okay? Can we use it? Is it bad? Whatever. Let's check it out. That's why it's like that, if you ever wondered. But of course, Windows opts into all that, and Windows 8.1 or higher, so it's good. It's already going to be there for all critical, like, browser, kernel, whatever, like, I don't know. Most of the Windows functions obviously are going to opt into it. The other sort of obvious flaw with coarse grain CFI is the fact that it's coarse grain. So if you can construct a valid sequence of functions by starting at the top of the function and running the entire thing that does something naughty, then you're allowed to do that. It doesn't block that. It allows that specifically by design. So that's the other thing that you could potentially abuse. So it's not fine-grained, it's coarse-grained. So you can call functions that shouldn't be called by this function pointer, but they have to be a valid function, and it has to be at the very start of it. You can't, start at the end like a Rob gadget or something does. So, and there's some other functions that are particularly interesting, maybe like virtual protect or NT continue. Maybe there are some interesting functions that you could call directly that, maybe you could abuse. So that, I think, is fairly obvious too. So we didn't mess with that much. The other sort of fairly obvious way to bypass something like CFG, again, is basically what I said the first time, which is use something that doesn't opt into it. Apparently, I'm told by Microsoft now that Adobe, since July of 2015, is now opting into modern protections, which apparently is true. I haven't actually verified it. Last I looked, which I guess would have been, I thought it was July, must have been, maybe it was June when I looked at it last. I don't know, it had to be July. I don't know. Anyway, last time I looked at a Flash exploit, it didn't use any, it wasn't opting into any like CFG or stuff like that. So basically, if you have a nice bug in Flash, you could just, Flash has been abused quite a bit recently, right? You probably heard about it in the news, and Java, of course, years before that. So if you've got some other juicy plugin, then you can just maybe use that. You don't have to directly try to break everything that's hardened in just the browser. Because usually the third-party stuff is weaker than the browser itself. We sort of know this, right? That's been the case for years. And other bypasses, there was a gentleman at Black Hat who presented a bypass against CFG, and he was a mitigation winner, so apparently his approach was cooler than ours because we got denied on any sort of recognition from Microsoft on this. We were not awarded, even though we tried to be awarded. We submitted ahead of time, and we're told that no, your bypass is important. We already know about that. Okay, so we'll talk about that more later. But basically, the way this bypass worked was the guard code itself was read only, but the author in this case found a way to force it to be read write, so he could change the actual code at that location, so that when the guard check happens, just return. Don't actually do the check. So it was pretty good. It was a nice technique that he had. So those are some of the prior researches and sort of either obvious or prior. And our goal was along those same lines. Can we find a generic bypass for this new protection? Okay. And, how hard would it be to use it, or how hard it is to fix it? So some analysis of that bypass as well, if we can find one. And so, like I said, we months ago did the responsible disclosure thing, and let Microsoft know about this problem, and they said, oh yeah, we already know about that. It's only a 32-bit problem. And then, just yesterday, in a panic, said, hey, be careful, maybe that really is bad. So I have to be careful about what I talk about today. So I'm going to censor some slides toward the end based on requests. Because, even though this, our technique, which we call stack Dsync, and I'll explain in a second what that means and how it works, it essentially only works on 32-bit systems, but IDEs always run as 32-bit, even on 64-bit systems, except if you use Edge now, it apparently is 64-bit on a 64-bit system. So that's good. So use everything new and don't ever use anything old, I guess is the obvious advice there. So how did we get the tip? Well, one tip that we were just given yesterday, which I had in real small print there, was if you'd read our patent, you'd have known that we mentioned something like this has already existed. So we didn't know about. I didn't read the patent apparently. So that wasn't the way we got tipped off to this as we were researching this. But one of the ways we got tipped off to an idea of how to do a bypass was actually by looking at the latest changes of some of the Windows DLLs. They included this move EBX ESP. So put the stack pointer in a register. And then after the function call, check the stack pointer again to make sure it's what it was. And that made us start think, maybe there's something with the stack pointer that can be abused at function call time, such that we can overwrite a return address or something. I mean, people have been overwriting return addresses forever, right? With like a stack, with Stack Overflow or something. So it's not that. It's not anything like that, but it's like that. It's basically changing a return address, but it's not actually by overwriting it. It's by pushing data to it ahead of time that it perceives to be. So we got Picard here doing the slow clap because we saw some code like this later, which was basically like a push arg call EAX ret. And we realized that's basically the vulnerable pattern. That's basically a generic way to bypass a coarse grain CFG that doesn't use return pointer protection. So, explain that. What's the problem with that? The problem is the value of EAX, so that what we're calling is something that we can control as an attacker. It's one of the functions that's in the valid function pointer. So, okay, cool. Okay, got it. So no problem with that. The issue, though, is a mix match in calling conventions. Okay? I don't know how many of you guys know what calling conventions are, but I'll do a real quick summary of it. But basically, standard calling conventions remove the arguments from the stack, where the other calling convention, the CDECL calling convention, doesn't. It expects the calling code to remove arguments from the stack. So it's possible that if a dynamic function pointer was expecting a particular calling convention, but you use one that has the other, you end up in this state where the stack pointer is basically desynced. You don't end up with stack pointer accounting of 0, which you should always have. So after a function's called and returns, you should always have the stack pointer exactly back to where it started to begin with. And if you don't, then you have a problem, right? The stack pointer is not in the right spot, and you might have seeded the stack with data that it might try to return to. That's basically our bypass in a nutshell. It's called stack desynchronization. And so just to review real quick, calling conventions. So the way a call works when you use CDECL, you push, push, call, push. Okay, so you've got like 4 D words on the stack. And then when you go to leave a function, you pop ret, which pops 2 words off the stack. And then the caller removes the arguments. So you have a stack pointer accounting of 0. So your function pointer is right back to where it was. Okay? And with standard call, exactly the same, except the callee removes those final 2 D words, in this case, 2 arguments, however many arguments there were. Okay? And it's up to compiler. Compilers figure out how do they want to do this, right? You could make whatever kind of calling convention you want, but the point is it needs to be consistent, especially for a protection like this to work, because it depends on the stack pointer always ending up back at the right spot. So, if you still didn't understand that, let me break it down a little slower here. So stack desynchronization works something like this. You push an argument of your choosing. Okay, so we're assuming that we found a bug of some sort that allows us to do stuff we shouldn't be able to. And we call a function of our choosing. Then when we do the first return from the first call, we're here. And then it didn't clean up its arg because it assumed one calling convention, but we use the other. And so when you return the second time from this wrapper function, which we just call Jackpot, for example, then you actually go to that address instead of the actual return address it should have gone to, because the stack was desynchronized by 1 D word in this case. Does that make sense? That's basically how stack desync works. So that's kind of the meat of our research, is just pointing out, hey, if you're running 32-bit code on a 64-bit system, which gives you the ability to have functions of different calling conventions. That's why that's important, that whole 32-bit, 64-bit thing. It's because if everything's standardized on 64-bit, then they don't have to mix, they shouldn't ever mix calling conventions. They should have standardized on a certain calling convention. Now, is that always true? Is it provably true? Is there absolutely no case that a stack desync could happen on a 64-bit system? I'm not convinced of that. I haven't looked into it more fully, but that's the claim, I guess. And so we started searching through all DLLs for examples of different functions that use different calling conventions to try to find and construct some goofy situation like that. Because even though we sort of had this theory, like, okay, we should be able to do this, we didn't have a concrete example of that, okay? And that's how research often works, right? You're like, I think I can do this, but I don't know if anything like that really exists. And so the search code is really nutty, so I won't even try to go through that. But basically, we turned up a number of interesting functions, which I had to censor for today's talk. So you can chain a few of these together and end up in that situation where you've got a stacked desync. So I'm going to this is going to cut time out of my talk. I was asked just yesterday to not talk about this a whole lot, so I'm going to cut portions of this out, and it'll make the talk a little shorter than it was planned to be, because this was going to be a decent part of the talk, which is explaining how we found these and which functions they were and how they work and how we get into this situation where we're stacked desynced. But I think it's probably okay. I think you guys still get the idea. I think you can still understand the concept that you can desync the stack by calling various functions that weren't meant to be called in particular orders. Like it was, this function pointer should always call a standard call, but we call it with a cduckle or whatever, vice versa. And so specifically, kernel 32 is the DLL on Windows 10 that we took a look at. Because some of the other DLLs, like I showed you at the beginning, had some of that extra checking where they actually check the sanity of stack pointer, and some don't. I think in the ones that don't, I think it's because they can't. They need to have mixed function pointers in there, and so there was no way to really do that. It's basically a limitation of the implementation, if you will. And the vulnerable pattern, which we called, the Jackpot Pattern, which if anybody's been in this scene a long time, they may recognize who that is. But you basically, sort of the idea is to be able to do a call and then be able to control a value and then push a value and then do another call, and then you can return from that. And again, I'm going to intentionally not explain that very well. I'm going to kind of breeze through this section so that we don't get too caught up in it. But the way we ended up doing it was basically calling a standard call function which removed too many arguments and ended up in a situation where we'd call a function that pushed some args, and from a different function we removed too many, and we ended up like in the middle of those so that we could return to one of our D words basically, so you could fully control where you return to. So basically, what does that give you? That gives you the ability to do your pivot again. And then you can start your ROP chain. So it doesn't mean you automatically win and you can own the world or some craziness like that. It's still hard, right? Because there's still all these protections you have to bypass. It's not like there's just one thing you have to try to break. You have to break this, and then you have to probably bypass something else, maybe Emmett, and then you probably have to, figure out a way to bypass who knows what else. Maybe first you had to bypass their isolated heap, and then maybe you have to, still run your ROP chain to bypass ASLR and depth. So there's quite some bit that you still have to do. It's not like you're just sort of done. But as far as this specific protection goes, thank you. Oh, it's festively warm too. Nice.
I'm drinking one too.
The creepy guy in the white hat shows up behind you. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it. That's why I like this conference. People appear out of trapdoors behind you and just hand you stuff. It's like, oh, what is this? All right, excellent. And I've got some more censored slides, which I won't explain. I know, right? Sorry, man. Yeah, there's nothing I can do about it. I was pressured on fairly extreme ends to make sure that I did the right thing today, so I'm trying my best to do that. No, that's the crappy part, right? The really crappy part is we already know that, no bounty, it's nothing, no big deal. And then yesterday it's okay, first of all, make sure you tell the world how great we are, and don't release your stuff because it's actually kind of bad. Okay, no. It sort of sucks, but I'm doing the right thing, so it is what it is. So basically what you've got, as I already said, you've got to do this desync, then a pivot, then a ROP, then a shellcode. Okay? And I'm going to blow through that too. I'm going to skip this. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip this. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip this. And I like Kirk, so we'll leave that. But what I will show, I'll show the very end of one of the demos I was going to show. I'm going to go through this quick because I don't, well, I'm still trying to do the right thing here, but basically, you see some code running which should never end up in arbitrary code, and as it runs, toward the end, you'll see it, let me make sure I'm covering up function names. You'll see it end up in a situation where it calls to arbitrary code, which it shouldn't. It should end in int 29, but instead it ends right there with a, it ends basically right there with a, oh, I can't stop it there apparently, with like a AA, BB, whatever, like a function pointer that arbitrary that we control that could be a pivot or anything you want. So that's basically the very censored shortened version of the CFG bypass demo. And what's interesting about this idea hasn't really been, I mean, I've been in this field a long time and I've never really heard somebody explain a function or a return address attack like that as a stacked organization. It's always been a return address overwrite. So probably the same idea could be used in other situations as well. Maybe there's some other type of bug where you could do this same idea. You could use some desyncing to change where basically you're changing control flow. Every memory corruption bug ends up in sort of a control flow hijack where basically control flow was supposed to be going like this and now it's over here doing this. That's really what CFI is intended to stop. CFI is meant to control the integrity of the flow, right? I mean, that's what CFI stands for. It's control flow integrity, right? You shouldn't have this situation where you're able to jump to an arbitrary pointer. So, in summary, maybe a little early, in summary, is it a good thing? Is CFG good? Am I glad that, Microsoft did it? Absolutely. Again, they're leading the way. They're the company out here doing this first. It's not Oracle. It's not Adobe. It's nobody else. It's Microsoft out here trying to put out a new compiler protection. And so we applaud them. It's great. They raise the bar. They make it that much harder for attackers to break code. Is it perfect? No. But, what it is, right? So as a researcher, I'm just here pointing out the design considerations that could go into this if they wanted to, if it were possible. And again, I think I talked about all that. Basically, it's not just CFG if you want to make a real attack code. There's a lot of things you have to break. Okay. So, what could be done? How hard would this have been to found? Is there a way to fix it? Any recommendations I have for you or for, the vendor who made this protection? For you, I would say, again, I already said it, but yeah, use the latest if you can. Push your dev team to upgrade their compiler. Why not? I don't know if they'll do it or not. Many dev teams push back, but if they'll do it, you're all the better, right? Use the latest version of Windows, all that stuff. For Microsoft, I think they need to find a way to validate return addresses, because I think this fundamental problem that return addresses are still not being validated is a control flow problem that's going to pop up again and again if it doesn't get addressed. So I think that that's my advice is to maybe do it in the same way. I don't maybe it shouldn't be that hard. I don't think there maybe a little harder than with function pointers because you can determine those at compile time. Return addresses maybe not quite as easy, but it shouldn't be that hard to come up with basically a bitmap of valid return address. You could do it in a coarse grain way. It still wouldn't be perfect like fine grain, but a coarse grain return protection shouldn't add that much overhead. Any fine grain protection for pointers and returns is going to add a lot of runtime overhead potentially, and without additional hardware support or something that can basically make that a lot more seamless. And I think that's a good area, and it wouldn't be the first time, right? So Intel and Microsoft, others have partnered many times in the past to make, DEP possible or hardware, enabled virtualization or whatever it is. So chip makers are always looking at things they can do from their end to make the operating system run smoother, faster, better. And I think this is one of those areas where embedding the capability to do a CFI all the way down in the chipset, and would be a good way to really make this industry a lot safer and, potentially make a good go at or a good stab at actually trying to solve memory corruption, which has always eluded, this industry. So that's sort of my advice and my recommendations. And that's all I have for you today. Any questions before I get off? No? Straightforward. Easy stuff. I don't know the answer to that question. The question was, when can you fully release the code sample and the POC and things like that would, I don't know the answer to that question. I've just been asked to, strongly encouraged not to right now. So despite the month's notice ahead of time. So. No, so that's why you have to recompile your code. Yeah. Well, so by default, any RWX chunk will be included in the bitmap of valid places you can go to. So like if you're doing some JIT, right, and you're saying, hey, I'm going to allocate some executable memory and just go there right now and build a function on the fly, you can do that, yeah. It's not the best way, you know, for this sort of thing to be used, because if you're doing that, I mean, that's sort of a security issue just in general. I mean, right? If you're making new executable chunks in memory all over the place, like that's kind of a bad, like probably you shouldn't do that in your code. You can, I mean, like Flash does it, like most JIT, like, I mean, a lot of like JavaScript engines and stuff, they do need to maybe do that, but it's better if they don't. And there are some APIs available to like say, I want to make this, you know, chunk executable and valid for the bitmap, but I only want to make it, you know, the start of it valid, not all parts of it or whatever. So there are some APIs where you can invalidate portions of executable memory as well on the fly. And so you can add to that basically on the fly, but most of it's basically compile time. Most of the, you know, call site locations can be determined at compile time for like, I don't know, 99% of code or something probably or whatever. I don't really know that. I just made that number up, but like all statistics, it's completely made up, but many of them. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, sir. No. They're not. In fact, I asked him to film it in such a way that the slides will be very small and hard to read on the video. Next question? Yes. Because there's a standardization on the calling convention, which makes that desynchronization more difficult. Is it impossible? I doubt it, and that's why I think that they need to address the return address integrity issue, because, and there's been a number of proposals throughout the past, if you've followed this industry for the last decade or whatever. Like I knew a researcher when I was doing my PhD at Michigan State, he had proposed way back in probably 2006 or something, 2007, basically the idea of a shadow stack, which could solve that. But again, maybe runtime without hardware support makes that harder. But like if you have a shadow stack that says, hey, we just pushed a return address over here, let's save it. Kind of like they do just in that code sample, you saw them save the stack in some register or something, and then check it before you return. But not like, I mean, they check it a bit late, right? But I think they check it after that function call returned. But you could check it at some point and then make sure it's the same. And there's probably a variety of other ways you could do either fine or coarse grain return pointer protection to hopefully really solve that piece of it. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Well, very good. Thank you.